friends and open-minded people wherever you might live in the world. This is David Duke, and this is the David Duke Show on the Rinse Radio Network, which you can also always find, of course, at davidduke.com. Today I have a very special presentation to you of my introduction to my new book, Behind Communism. The subtitle of the book is The Ethnic Origins of the Russian Revolution and the Greatest Holocaust in the History of Mankind. The book begins with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You must understand, the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. They hated Russians. They hated Christians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human remorse. The October Revolution was not what you call in America the, quote, Russian Revolution. It was an invasion and conquest over the Russian people. More of my countrymen suffered horrific crimes at their blood-stained hands than any people or nation ever suffered in the entirety of human history. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time. The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. That's from Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn. These were startling words, spoken to me by the famous Russian writer and philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn when I had the privilege of meeting him in Moscow in 2002. His words made me fully realize the fact that most of the people of the world know little about the tribalist entity which created and drove the communist juggernaut that took over Russia. They know frighteningly little about the greatest slaughters in history, the genocide of tens of millions of people that was spawned by deep ethnic hatred. For many people, even some of those who have studied the Russian Revolution in history courses in universities around the world, this is the secret behind communism. This secret, even though it's plain to see if one just looks closely, is rarely spoken about in either the mainstream press or in mainstream academia. The revolution occurred in Russia, and although a percentage of Russians participated in it, it was not a Russian revolution. It was led by an alienated, non-Russian, Jewish ethnic minority who hated Russia, Russians, and the Tsar for their alleged anti-Semitism. Their fellow tribalists all over the world financed and supported and provided shock troops that executed the brutal takeover of the Russian government. Upon achieving total power, their deep, psychopathic, racist hatred against Russians became manifest in the greatest human slaughter of all time. Any historian who has studied modern communism from its ideological origins in Karl Marx and Moses Hess through the mass dispossession, forced starvations, and gulags of the 20th century is aware that communists are the real world champions of mass murder. There is no historical dispute about the fact that communist regimes killed many more times the number of innocents than any other regime in history, including Hitler's Germany. But unlike members of the National Socialist regime, the greatest mass murderers of all time have not been hunted down across the face of the earth. They've not faced trial for their horrific crimes against humanity. Perhaps even more importantly, they've never faced the court of popular revulsion. Why? It's because these communist perpetrators have been shielded by their tribal brethren who have an inordinate influence on media, academia, and in governments. The deaths in just one of the many communist killing fields totaled 5 to 8 million men, women, and children of the Ukraine who were starved, killed, imprisoned, and worked to death in what is today called the Holodomor. It totals a death number equal or even greater than the numbers in what today is called the Holocaust. Today, nearly every person on Earth, through mass media and government commemoration, is aware of and empathizes with the victims of the Holocaust. But 99% of humanity are completely unaware of the Ukrainian Holodomor. The world has been inundated with both fictional and non-fictional dramas about the suffering of Jews and Jewish children, such as Anne Frank in the war. However, the great masses have not been led to shed tears for the little girls of Ukrainian and Russian heritage who suffered and died. They are unknown, unremembered, and unmourned in the media of today. People are unconscious and cut off from empathy for the millions murdered by the Bolsheviks in Russia, even if they have a vague knowledge of the millions suffering under communism. Very few people have an emotional attachment to the victims of the communists because Hollywood and the media have done nothing to instill any concern for them. That's in stark contrast to their unending dirge of the Jewish Holocaust. In the Hollywood media of movies and television and broadcasting and major publishing, every adult has absorbed thousands of hours of what is called the Holocaust. It is the trademarked jealous God which demands no other gods before it. I want to point out that I show a number of pictures of the Holodomor and other victims of Soviet communism, pictures that you're not so familiar with, that they don't show you constantly on television and in the newspapers. I show a picture of an emaciated, beautiful little girl who was starved to death in the intentional ethnic genocide of the Ukrainian people. You don't know her name. You don't know her story. The same Hollywood that brings you the Holocaust almost every day of your life shows you nothing about the largest genocide in the history of mankind. Why? When I met Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he just published his last work called 200 Years Together. It was about the Jewish experience in Russia and contained 3 chapters devoted to discussing the Jewish role in the revolutionary genocide and secret police purges of Soviet Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. I waited for 10 years in vain for the book to be published in English. It remains unpublished in English to this day. Of course, the secret behind communism must remain a secret to most of the public. Solzhenitsyn knew that he would be condemned for daring to point out the secret, but he went ahead nonetheless, telling me that it was his duty to tell the truth so that the world would know. He paid the price. Although the book was a runaway bestseller in Russia, this last important book by the Nobel Prize-winning author has never been published in English, so the largest audience in the world has been denied the truth. The controlled media had to mute this great man's voice. However, this book, The Secret Behind Communism, will somewhat remedy that suppression, for it contains many important and relevant quotations from 200 Years Together. Many of the revealing quotes that were the reason that the book has not been published fully in English. It wasn't the first time that Solzhenitsyn had raised the subject of the Jewish ethnic driving force behind communism and its slaughters in his famous The Gulag Archipelago books 1, 2, and 3. He described his imprisonment by the Soviets, and he pointed out that almost all the commanders of the Gulag camps were Jews, by famously including pictures, which I show in my book, of 6 Jewish Chekist Gulag bosses of the 1930s. In 200 Years Together, Solzhenitsyn wrote that he had taken their pictures from an official Soviet-era publication which boasted about the gulags. Despite Solzhenitsyn's efforts and those of many others, including Frank Britton, and some of his excellent work and research is included in this volume, the truth about the Jewish supremacist role in the creation, execution, and maintenance of world communism, and the Russian Revolution in particular, remains little known. The reason for this is simple. The Jewish supremacist tribalists who influence major media throughout the West make sure that almost nothing is said about the fact that Jews, along with organized Jewish support worldwide, not only created communism, but were the leaders who brought it into such grim reality. They were indeed the nexus of the greatest slaughter and mass human suffering in history. This is the core of the secret behind communism, exposed and overwhelmingly documented in this book. Next section is the paramount Jewish role in communism, no secret in Israeli media. Ironically, Jewish historians are quite happy to discuss the leading Jewish role among themselves, although any Gentile who dares to raise the topic is immediately decried as a, quote, anti-Semite.